Now moving on to Chapter 5. A Lost Rifle is Found. Read by George Oberting.
Chapter 5. A Lost Rifle is Found. Even though the fighting between the Seminoles and the white men was over, there were still plenty of reminders of what happened. Just a little ways away from our lighthouse, a point of land stuck into the Loxahatchee River. There was an old, abandoned fort on this island. Captain Armour said the fort used to be called Fort Jupiter. The Seminoles and the U.S. Army had fought over the fort for a long time before the lighthouse was even built. Tiger knew about the fort too, because his grandfather had actually attacked it during the Second Seminole War. Because the fort had been made of wood and because of the extreme humidity, the fort was mostly destroyed. In Florida, winter was almost like summer in Chicago, and the weather was nice almost every day. But by April, Mama was already complaining about the heat, and the grown-up men wore loose shirts or no shirts at all and sweated all day, every day. Pretty soon, the rain started, and I learned what Captain Armour meant when he said that summer in Florida is like being a lobster in a pot. It was very, very hot, and it rained almost every day in the late afternoon. Tiger never seemed bothered by the heat. He thought it was funny when he saw Papa with a red face and sweat rolling down his neck. He said Indians weren't bothered by the heat. Papa and Mr. Carlin also complained because the heat and the dampness destroyed wood so fast. They had to constantly repair the house. The lighthouse was fine because it was made from brick. Because no one was fixing the old fort, however, it was mostly ruined. Much of it had fallen down, the roof had caved in, and the rotten walls were full of animals and all kinds of huge bugs. But I thought it was the best place to play anywhere around. Tiger and I spent whole afternoons pretending to attack and defend the fort. I was usually a U.S. Army officer, and he played his grandfather, who actually did attack the fort many moons ago. Tiger was good at this game. Seminoles can move through the forest without making any sound at all, and he snuck up on me all the time. We tried to switch our roles a few times, but it didn't work. I was too loud to be a Seminole, and Tiger didn't like playing a U.S. Army officer. He said it made him unhappy to pretend to kill Seminoles. When we weren't in the fort, we sometimes went exploring up the river. Tiger had his own small canoe. His father made it for him out of a log cypress wood that he hollowed out. Tiger taught me how to sit in the middle and paddle so the canoe wouldn't flip over, and we would glide down the river, pretending to shoot alligators and looking for herons or snook. One day we went further up the river than we had ever before. The oak trees were growing close to the river, and the branches wore Spanish moss like beards. "Listen," Tiger said. "I don't hear anything except the wind." Yes, he told me we were near a haunted place where the wind talked to people. He said it was haunted because many white men and Seminoles died here. It was an old battlefield from the Seminole Wars. He looked nervous because his father had told him never to go to this place. The area was like no other place I had ever seen. The river narrowed and weaved through beautiful oak hammocks that hung over the river. We found a spot along the river to wedge the canoe so it couldn't float away. Then we climbed up the riverbank and walked through the beautiful forest of ancient oak trees. Unlike the fort, which still had walls, cisterns, and wells, the battlefield site was just a grassy meadow. We walked slowly through the haunted forest. "Look," I said, bending over to pick up a used bullet. It turned out the ground was littered with things left over from the battle. We found used bullets, U.S. Army belt buckles, arrowheads, and metal buttons that must have been attached to military uniforms that had long since disintegrated. Pretty soon, we found our first skeleton, half buried under leaves. Tiger and I stood in silence, staring at it. I'd never seen a skeleton before. It looked so small. Overhead, the wind rattled in the oak trees, and I wondered whether the old battlefield really was haunted. There were scraps of clothing still hanging from the mossy old bones, and Tiger pointed silently to an arrowhead logged in a rib. "Soldier," he whispered, his eyes wide. After that, we found a lot more skeletons. A few of them had bullet holes in their skulls where they had been shot. These were dead Seminoles, and I felt bad for Tiger because he said that some of these warriors might have been in his tribe a long time ago. Later, I learned that we had found the graveyard of the greatest battle of the Second Seminole War. The battle occurred in January 1838. Tiger and I didn't talk hardly at all. He was afraid of upsetting the spirits, and I was daydreaming. It seemed as if I could even hear the sounds of the battle in front of the forest around me. I stared into the treetops, trying to understand what the voices were saying. Tiger's father said you had to listen closely to understand the language of the winds. Whap! I snapped out of it when I walked straight into the biggest oak tree I'd ever seen and fell down. I got back up and brushed myself off. Then I checked my cheek to see if I was bleeding. I wasn't. I couldn't believe I didn't see the tree. Its trunk was almost as big around as the lighthouse. The bottom of the trunk was hollow and big enough for a grown man to stand up inside. I was afraid there might be a bear or snakes or some other critter inside the trunk, so I only put my head in slowly. After my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something glitter in one corner. I squinted to see it, but it was all the way in the back of the trunk. I was afraid to walk into the darkness. If I got bit by a snake or attacked by a bear, I didn't want Tiger to have to explain how I died in the one place his father told us to never go. Then I remembered that I had some matches wrapped in a burlap cloth in my back pocket. I removed a match and struck it on the bark of the tree. There were no animals inside. There was nothing inside except a gleaming, perfectly preserved rifle leaned against one of the sides of the trunk. Just as the flame of the match reached my fingers, I grabbed the rifle and ran out of the tree trunk. I yelled for Tiger, and he came running from somewhere deep in the forest. What? Look! I held the rifle up so he could see it. This was no standard issue army rifle. The stock and barrel were engraved with elaborate designs. Engraved on the butt of the rifle was a man's name, Major William Lauderdale. Who's that? Tiger said. I don't know. It sounds familiar, but I don't know who it is. Tiger grunted. We go now, he said. I think he wasn't comfortable about the rifle, or maybe he was just worried his father might find out he had been on the battlefield. If Tiger's father found out, Tiger would never be allowed to play with me again. I took the rifle back to the canoe without even thinking about how I could explain it to Papa where it came from. But I couldn't leave it behind. It was the nicest rifle I had ever seen, and the rifles were expensive. Back at the lighthouse, I told Papa the truth about where rifles came from. He agreed not to tell Tiger's father where he had been. But I knew Papa was unhappy with me for helping Tiger disobey his father. Tiger and I never returned to that battlefield site again. Captain Armour recognized the name William Lauderdale right away. He said that Lauderdale was the officer who commanded a group of soldiers called the Tennessee Volunteers at the battle 35 years ago. He became famous, and a fort farther down the coast was later named for him. Some years later, when I was an adult, I traveled many times to Fort Lauderdale. After we sanded some rust off it and oiled the firing pin, the rifle worked perfectly. Papa kept a watchful eye on my use of it until I got a little older. When I was a teenager, though, I used it almost every day. I kept the rifle for the rest of my life. While I would own other rifles during my lifetime, none ever fired as true, straight, and far as old Lauderdale.